Hello, good crowd. Wow, today we are really going to have an important conversation about water with Mindy Lubber, the CEO and president of Ceres. You do not want to miss this discussion.
Welcome to the Your Mark on the World show with your champion of social good, Devin D. Thorpe.
Please support the sponsors who made this episode possible, including Johnson & Johnson's Caring Crowd and GoodCrowd.School. Mindy, welcome to the show.
Great to be joining you, Devin. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We're so grateful that you'd make time for this discussion, and it's such an important discussion. My heavens. You're working with some of the largest companies in the world on water issues. Tell us about what you're doing.
Sure. Devin, there's been so much talk about climate change, and water is certainly an important subset of that. I mean, we take water for granted. Just turn on our water, turn on our shower. I say, boy, I could use a 20-minute shower, when I should probably be taking a 20-second or 1 or 2 minute shower.
Yeah.
We act like we have unlimited resources for almost everything we use, with water being a priority. At the same time, the World Economic Forum and many economic analysts say we will have 30% less water by 2030. That's a mere 10 plus years from now that we need to operate as a society. And what does that mean? It means devastating impacts on our economy, on our lives, on the lives of women. Basically, we can't function without enough water. And if we don't start today, or really yesterday or 10 years ago, in preserving water and being smart about it and not wasting it, we're going to get to that point with 30% less water. And I'll add one other point. I gave you a statistic about where we might have less water in 2030. The reality is, we've all read about Cape Town in South Africa 6 months ago. They were at ground zero, no water. In India, there are major cities, Chennai being one of them, where they have literally no water. They are trucking it in and bringing it on trains. And women are spending 4 hours a day getting water from lakes and streams that aren't even perfectly clean in a way to adapt. Well, we can't adapt to that.
It is really scary. And I think you're so right how we take this for granted. We just assume it will be there. You said something that is really interesting at the outset. And I want to just drill down on this a little bit because you're the expert. But what is the correlation between climate change and water? I'm not sure we all draw that connection in an obvious and logical way.
Well, as we know, climate change impacts almost everything in our economy, in our lives, frankly, in the future of our kids, and even in our futures, you and I, Devin, even if we're not 20 years old anymore. But it's here and it's now. It's not about something in the future. And it impacts, and I'll come back to water, but it impacts immigration. Our country's torn apart right now on immigration. We will see far more migration from cities that are inundated with problems created by climate. That will exacerbate this problem that we call immigration. It impacts every sector of our economy. It impacts all of our resources. And as for water, there are parts of the world where rains are far more fierce and regular. And what used to be considered a 100-year storm, meaning a storm that comes every 100 years, we're now seeing those come regularly. And what does it mean when there's far too much water? It means crops are ruined, agricultural, food, apparel that depends on cotton. Half of our economy is dependent upon water. So in some parts of the country in the world, we have too much water. In other parts of the country in the world, we have too little water. And either one is not good for any of us.
Yeah, that is really scary. I mean, and we see both, right, around the world. You highlighted at the outset some of the cities where there is no water, which I think is in some ways a more obvious scare. But I remember driving through the Midwest over the Mississippi in 1993 when they had what they called a 500-year storm. And then they had one just like it a year later.
Correct.
Right?
Not a 500-year storm.
Yeah, not anymore. And we just are only beginning to appreciate how devastating the effects of climate change are with respect to so many aspects of our lives, water chief among them. So what are you working with companies to do? How do you help companies, or how do they help you?
Well, first we need to make the economic case. I mean, think about California a couple of years ago during the drought. Their farms were operating at about half the production level. So the devastation to farmers, to people buying that food, to farm workers who were being laid off, to truckers who carry the farm's produce to restaurants, it was devastating economically on so many fronts. And 70% of our water is in agricultural use. So we're certainly trying to focus there, how to work with farmers, how to work with some of the largest fast food companies and the largest companies using water, and getting them to adopt new systems, new practices, new design. They could use far less water, and really they need to, and we need to start now. Or even think about the Colorado River. We all depend on the Colorado River, half our country. $5 billion worth of commerce takes place along the Colorado River. That river has been depleted. Every year it gets more serious and worse. And it is a precious resource to every one of us, you in the Midwest, me on the East Coast. We all benefited from it. And watching it get depleted and businesses of $5 trillion worth of the economy suffer is just not acceptable anymore as we move forward. So we've got to use our water more smartly. We've got to use it better. We've got to get rid of those 20-minute showers that you and I are probably guilty of. And
I know I am.
Right. But really think about it differently as a resource that's going to be depleted, not something that lasts forever and will always be there when we turn on that faucet.
Yeah, that's such a powerful point. I live out here in Utah where the Colorado River is nearby. And in fact, some of our water in Utah comes from the Colorado. And of course, to your point, and not only is the river itself flowing less, the shares of the Colorado River were divided up based on a hypothetical flow rate that was wrong when it was written and optimistic, at least by an order of 2. So there's never been as much water. Now there's at least less than half of what the water rights presume. So it is a mess. It is a huge mess. So it's really an important observation, Mindy. So tell us a little bit about how you engage with corporations around the world.
Sure. And we engage with 2 classes of the economy or sectors. And we engage with investors who, until a couple of years ago, weren't even analyzing climate risk and water risk. So what does that mean? You evaluate a company, you make a decision to invest in it, and you just find out after the fact that that company is dependent upon opening up new factories in 10 cities that already have not enough water, and they're not going to be allowed to open. So we've got to evaluate it. We've got to learn who's using water, who's dependent upon it, and that then drives the financial community to ask more questions, to push companies to use less water, to manage their water better. We've got to look at it comprehensively. And with companies, we're working with them, large financial companies, large corporations, to set goals. If they're using X amount of water now, maybe it could be 20% less next year and 30% less the following year. And the technology is there to help us use less, but we've got to be really conscious of that. And finally, or not finally, but one other thing, companies have to be more conscious about polluting the water. We talk about meat, and it's an interesting industry sector, and I'm not sure until recently we all realized how complicated the meat industry is. It makes climate change substantially worse, but also the byproducts of producing meat and farming the animals, and the pollution it creates in our rivers and streams costs us billions of dollars and tens of billions of dollars in losses in water. So we've got to change our mindset and how we practice using water, and we've got to do it now. 30% less water in 2030, or even now, 30% 30 cities around the world are like Chennai, India. They are suffering from almost no water, and life is pretty uncomfortable there. We don't want to see that happening in more places.
Can you imagine? I mean, yeah, I can't even imagine. I just can't even imagine life without water. It is literally unimaginable.
And Devin, you just said it. You can't imagine it because we can't do it.
Yeah.
Certain things we could survive with. My kids might have learned to survive without chocolate candy when they were young. We cannot survive without water. We can't run an economy, and we can't run a humanity.
Mark Tursick, the head of the Nature Conservancy, wrote a brilliant book a few years back, and he talked a little bit about water in that book. And he highlighted an analogy that has, or a story that has stuck with me ever since. But 20 years ago, neither Coke nor Pepsi identified water as an ingredient in its products, nor as a subject in its annual reports, to shareholders. But since then, they've actually gotten much better. They identify water as an ingredient. They talk about their exposure to water, and both companies have set goals to be more water conscientious. And Coke set the goal to be someday soon, and I can't remember the time threshold, but they set the goal to be, water neutral. So they would be preserving as much water as they were using in their products. And then Pepsi decided they would be water positive. They would outdo Coca-Cola and be water positive. What are you seeing with those companies? Is that a typical reaction? Is it a genuine reaction? What's your take on that?
Well, it's real, and we're delighted and pleased and work very closely with both of those companies, and they are moving forward. I would say they're in the leadership category, and they learned the hard way. I mean, Coke went in, tried to locate 2 new manufacturing facilities in India, and they basically lost their license to operate. They were told they can't do it because there wasn't enough water. It was a very clear message after losing hundreds of millions of dollars. You've got to be conscious of this. And both Coke and Pepsi have set goals, and that shows us it can be done. They use enormous amounts of water, and over the next several years, Coke will be, for every ounce of water they use, they will put back into the system, and PepsiCo as well. But you got to be very, very mindful. You've got to be focused. You've got to set realistic goals or audacious goals. You got to make them transparent so the public knows, and you've got to be accountable. And I think both companies are doing that. Are we seeing it across the board in either the beverage or the agricultural sector? Not nearly as much. There are random companies that are leading, but most are still lagging. And that's the challenge. That's what we spend our time doing, trying to help those companies set very clear and extensive and audacious goals, and then helping them figure out how to meet those goals.
Yeah. And as you work with them, tell us a little bit about your process. Are you invoicing them? With whom are you meeting? What does your team look like? What does their team look like? I'm just wanting to get inside the tent for a minute with you.
Sure. And it's a great question because we're not consultants. We're an advocacy organization. We're a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. We're like Mark Tursick and the Nature Conservancy. And so we push hard. We work with companies. We're not standing outside their doors picketing, but we push hard for them to change their practices. And with us pushing hard are some of their largest owners. So 175 of our members in our investor network on climate risk and sustainability are the largest asset owners who own almost every company in the marketplace. When I go to see the CEO of one of the largest fast food companies, they may be interested in talking to Mindy Lubber. They may not. They may find us pushing too hard. But if I'm accompanied by 5 of their largest owners who say, as a matter of shareholder value, we think you're limiting the value of your company by ignoring water, they're almost always willing to start a conversation and work with us to set goals.
That's amazing. Do you stay engaged with them through the process, or is it more of a get that commitment from them and move on to the next company? Because there's a lot of companies using a lot of water.
Yeah. Probably some of both. We're not technical advisors, so we're certainly not, when they present goals, saying, here's the kind of pipes, here's the technology, this is what you got to do to get there. But we do stay involved with them and seek transparency. A very clear part of what we ask companies to do is to make sure that they set specific goals, that they can be held accountable, and that they're very transparent about those goals. We also try and change the systems of the company so it's easier. And let me give you an example. We spend a lot of time working with corporate board directors and training corporate board directors on why water risk or climate risk are financial risks and fiduciary issues that belong at a corporate board level. Because if a board is not looking at the threats to not having enough water for a company that uses water in every product, then I'd argue they're not doing their job. So we try and get these issues integrated at the board level, tied to the compensation of the CEO, integrated into strategic planning, and throughout not only the company, but the company's supply chain. And we do work with them on an ongoing basis on that systems approach.
There's an organization called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, kind of modeled on the Financial Accounting Standards Board to create sustainability accounting standards, which makes sense for the SASB. But you're in the trenches on this every day, looking at exactly these kinds of issues. Are you seeing more companies reporting these sorts of things? Are they using, for instance, the SASB standards? Are they using other standards? Are you promoting a different or alternative standard of reporting? What's the state of play on reporting publicly on their water progress?
So it's a great question. We work closely with SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, on what their standards and metrics should look like, and urge companies to use that or to use the Global Reporting Initiative. Ceres founded something in the mid-90s, spun it off to be its own independent standard-setting body. And the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, has about 12,000 companies reporting on their environmental, social, governance footprint. The standards are compatible, GRI and SASB, and there are others, and they're good. They work together. One big difference is SASB calls for more transparency and disclosure around financial issues. And GRI is a bit broader. It's financial issues. It's issues that matter to the community and to the labor workforce. So they're slightly different, but we're seeing more of that coming together. And with companies, we urge them to use one or both. And it really is about measuring the impact of your company on water, on climate, on other things, because you almost can't manage it if you don't measure it. It may be a little business school ditty of what gets measured gets managed, but it's also true. Yeah. You can't fix something or manage it if you don't even know what the problem is. So I'm big on transparency, and I think SASB and GRI are two great examples of systems to do that. And the metrics are being used. The data is being used. Go look at Bloomberg. Anybody in finance has a Bloomberg terminal sitting on their desk. Yeah. They have part of that terminal access to ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance, one of the most broadly used platforms on Bloomberg's platform. So it's not just environmentalists care about it. This is a core part of our economy. Analysts are looking at the data as well as many others, and it's time it got fully integrated.
You've been doing this for a little while. How long? Remind me.
I've been at Ceres for 17 years, so more than a little while. Before that, I was a regulator. That's right. But
you were at the EPA for you were a big deal in the Clinton administration and the EPA.
I was the regional administrator for New England, and I will say one clear thing when I left the EPA. And I had spent time as a litigator or a lawyer, as a regulator, that if the capital markets, if companies and investors were not part of the journey to deal with sustainability issues, we couldn't get there. We will not succeed without the support of, yes, we need government and we need policy changes and mandates, but we also need the leadership of corporate America and the financial community, and we need to move quickly.
What do you see that's different? If you think about the biggest differences between your earliest days in this work and today, uh, what do you see different?
It's a good question, and I will tell you it's very different, truly very different. Different enough? No. But 15 years ago, when I went to a large company or their CEO and said, you ought to be addressing climate change or water shortages, I mean, they thought it was cute and nice, and, well, maybe we'll make a contribution and do a little work in some community. Why don't you go talk to our philanthropy? And we made the argument, this is not about your philanthropy. It's a nice thing for you to do to support good work. This is about changing the way you do business. And I will tell you, 15 years ago, it was seen as silly or quaint or charming, but not real. And I'd say by 10 years ago, the discussions got a little bit more real. And over the last 5 years, there are far more companies and investors who are analyzing the risk of climate, of water, of shortages of materials, and who are starting to act on it. Now, I'll tell you, it's radically different, but we need far more radical change. I mean, I could probably tell you about 100 or 200 companies who are doing exemplary work, but we have 100,000 or 200,000 other companies that are not. And as much as I think capital markets are crucial to this discussion, and they are, and that's where we spend all of our time, we're going to need policy change as well. You need a level playing field. It's not fair to ask Coke and Pepsi to do something, but every other beverage container not do something. We need to build that level playing field, and we need a mandate that all parties are part of the solution. And it's not always painful, but we need consistent practices.
Yeah. As you look forward, say another 15 years, where would you like to be? What would you like to see in terms of milestones and progress 15 years from now when you and I get back together and talk again? I hope we'll talk regularly between now and then, but 15 years from now, what do you hope you're telling me then?
And I do hope we talk sooner, but just think about it, Devin. We're saying all of these issues are impacted by climate change. We're also told by the scientists that we have about 12 years, nobody could pinpoint it to the day, to have profound change going on if we're to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, a 1.5 to 2.2 degree world. And, those degrees don't mean anything to the average person, but it's where we have to go, and it demands a massive change. That means we need to change our economy almost entirely from a fossil fuel-driven economy to a non-fossil fuel-driven economy. By 2030, we need to be close to getting there, and by 2040 or 50, we need to be a non-fossil fuel future. That's not going to be easy. I can't call up ExxonMobil and Chevron and ConocoPhillips or Shell and say, hey, by the way, maybe you ought to go out of business. They're big companies. They've done a lot. They're smart. They didn't get there because they're stupid. But their product is creating the catastrophe that we're walking into. The World Economic Forum says we are sleepwalking into catastrophe. Their words, not mine. It's economists and corporate leaders. And so we've got to be ready for radical change. Not all of it has to be painful, but it has to be real. It has to be measured. It has to be determined. And we need to start today.
I want to drill down on your comments about Exxon. I had lunch last week with an executive that he wasn't on the record, so I won't say what company, but he was from an oil and gas company. And I asked him, who at your shop is in charge of thinking about strategy around climate change? Whose job is that? And there was no one. There was no one at that company with that job. Now, it's a much smaller company than ExxonMobil, but when you go to companies like ExxonMobil, do they have someone? They must have someone whose job is to think about that. What is the sort of dialogue you have with oil and gas companies?
Sure. And I will tell you, they have a lot of people. The big companies, they've got teams, they've got small armies dealing with it. And it's insane enough that we're moving forward at the pace. If they were not looking at this point in today's world, 2019, I would argue there's a breach of fiduciary duty at their board level, at their CEO level, and so on. But it's a harsh thing to say to a company that has spent their entire existence learning, building, intellectual capacity, technical capacity, being quite successful, building an industry product that is poisoning our economy and our environment. And so it's not easy for them to say, okay, sure, yeah, let me go to my board at the next board meeting and tell them I think we ought to be on a 10-year plan to go out of business. I know of no CEO excited to be doing that. But what we do say, and I will say there are some oil companies that are starting to transition, Shell being one of them. You've got to start transitioning to renewable energy and other energy systems. Now, even that is not a welcome thought. They say, we're an oil and gas company. It has nothing to do with solar and wind. We can neither move as quickly into that as we could into women's underwear. It's not what we do. It's not the product we make. But we are starting to see oil and gas companies pick up, whether it's going from 2% or 5% of their business to other models. Now, that doesn't get us there. I mean, the reality is we right now don't have the technology to capture the pollution, the greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel. Fossil fuels are clearly what is making us see the impacts of climate change. And it has to change. That has to become a smaller part of our economy. I don't suggest it will be easy, but we don't have a choice. You and I, our future, whether kids or grandkids or nephews and nieces, we are building a future for them that is not the future, that is not the life we have.
Yeah. The market's going to give us some help. I was speaking with Drawdown Executive Director Jonathan Foley last week.
Right. A good guy and a good friend. Yeah.
Yeah, great guy. He and I were talking, and he gave me a little bit of hope. He was a little bit optimistic. He said, this is the biggest business opportunity in human history. Right? We need to rebuild our whole economy. And we can see that as a burden, or we can see it as an opportunity. And when you look at it as an opportunity, it gets kind of exciting.
Correct.
Not very much for ExxonMobil or some of these other, I shouldn't pick on ExxonMobil, but they're big, so they come to mind readily. But they're generating billions of dollars a year in profit. It seems like they have money to invest in the new economy.
Well, they're slowly, but they've resisted for decades and decades and decades. But I agree with Jonathan in that there is a future. We can use the technology to start changing. The millions of jobs that we've created in the United States alone from solar and wind, the fact that solar and wind are now competitive price-wise with fossil fuels. We're making progress, and we've got a lot more progress to make. So we've got to build that out and see the jobs come in our own communities, which is a great thing. We need those jobs, and we're seeing more and more of them.
Mindy, what is your superpower?
Maybe perseverance and hope, maybe lunacy. But we've got to keep at it, and I remain hopeful. The challenges are big. I've been fighting these fights for 38 years of my career, and I've seen change and a lot of it. And the problems grow. We've got to grow in tenacity and strategy.
Yeah. Mindy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know you're busy and you've got to run, but before you go, would you take just a minute to tell people how they can learn more about Ceres and the work that you're doing and how they can connect with you personally?
Great. Devin, that's great. We've got a website like everybody else, and I hope it's thoughtful. Please go to it, www.ceres.org, O-R-G. We're a nonprofit. And you could find all of our email addresses and how to connect with us right there. And it really does tell the story, what you can do to make change, what you can do as an individual, as a company, how as an individual you could use your power. Shop someplace where the company cares about these issues. Invest your money in investment vehicles where they're looking at these issues, because it's the smart way to go. Don't sit in the shower or stand in the shower for 20 minutes or eat meat 7 nights a week. There's a lot everyone could do, even as individuals, let alone the big companies we're working with and the big investors.
Great reminder. Great reminder. Well, Mindy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And we wish you every success in solving the water crisis and climate change along with it.
Great. Thank you. Be well.
All righty. Let's do some good.
Take care.
At Caring Crowd, we believe everyone has the power to make a difference. Through our crowdfunding platform for community health, we empower passionate people to drive real change. Whether you work for a nonprofit organization, volunteer, or want to get involved for the first time, you can post a campaign on Caring Crowd. Join us, because caring is where change begins.
At goodcrowd.school, 5% of what you pay to learn how to make a difference goes to nonprofits working to eradicate extreme poverty, improve global health, and reverse climate change by 2045. So when you take a course to learn how to change the world, you do change the world. Get started at goodcrowd.school today. Thanks for tuning in to the Your Mark on the World show, the Social Impact Podcast. Please subscribe via YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or Spotify.